If you've ever walked outside on a hot afternoon and thought to yourself, I've handled summers my whole life, this is nothing new, I want you to keep watching because that exact thought is the one that quietly puts so many older adults at risk every single year, not because they're careless, not because they don't take care of themselves, but because the body changes with age in ways that don't always show up until the moment it matters most. Maybe you're the kind of person who still gets out in the garden in July because it's always brought you peace. Maybe you're caring for a spouse and so busy looking after them that you forget to check in with yourself. Or maybe you're an adult child watching your parents from a distance, wondering if they're really okay when they tell you, we're fine, don't worry. If any of that sounds familiar, this video is for you. I'm Dr. Robert Vance, and I've spent a good part of my career talking with older adults and their families about the small, everyday decisions that end up mattering far more than people expect. Heat is one of those topics that seems simple on the surface. Drink water, stay cool, don't overdo it. But the reality is more nuanced than that. And the truth is, the advice that worked for you at 50 doesn't always work the same way at 70 or 80. Your body's relationship with heat genuinely changes as you get older, and understanding that change is the first step towards staying safe without living in fear. So today I want to walk you through 5 mistakes I see over and over again with adults over 60 when it comes to heat. Some of these might surprise you. One of them in particular has less to do with the weather outside and more to do with what's sitting in your medicine cabinet, and I think you'll want to hear that one. By the end of this, my hope is that you won't feel worried, you'll feel prepared. That's really the goal here, not fear, preparation. Let's start with why this even happens in the first place, because once you understand the why, everything else I tell you will make a lot more sense. When you were younger, your body had a remarkably efficient cooling system. You would sweat. That sweat would evaporate, and your blood vessels near the skin would widen to release heat. All of this happening automatically without you ever having to think about it. As we age, several parts of that system become less responsive. Sweat glands often become less active. The blood vessels don't dilate as quickly or as efficiently. And many older adults have a blunted thirst response, meaning the body doesn't send that I'm thirsty signal the way it used to, even when fluid levels are getting low. So you could be genuinely dehydrated and not feel particularly thirsty at all. That single fact alone explains a lot of what goes wrong during heat waves, and we'll come back to it. On top of that, many common health conditions, heart disease, diabetes, kidney issues can affect how well the body regulates temperature and fluid balance. And certain medications, which we'll talk about honestly and responsibly, can also change how your body handles heat. None of this means you're fragile or that you need to avoid summer altogether. It simply means your margin for error is a little smaller than it used to be. And knowing that gives you the power to plan ahead instead of being caught off guard. I like to explain it this way to my patients. Think of your body's cooling system like a home air conditioning unit that's been running faithfully for decades. It still works, it's not broken, but it doesn't respond quite as quickly as it once did, and it takes a little more strain to keep up on the hottest days. That doesn't mean you throw the whole system out. It means you pay a little more attention to it, and you don't push it as hard as you might have 30 years ago. That's really the mindset I want you to carry through this entire video, not alarm, just attentiveness. There's another piece of this puzzle that I think deserves mention before we move forward, and it's one that often gets overlooked. Older adults are also more likely to have a reduced sense of feeling overheated in the first place. In younger people, feeling flushed, sweaty, or uncomfortably hot is usually a fairly reliable internal alarm. That alarm can become quieter with age, meaning the body may already be under real strain before you consciously register that anything is wrong. This is exactly why so many of the mistakes we're about to discuss aren't really about carelessness. They're about a mismatch between what your body used to tell you clearly and what it tells you now, often more faintly. With that foundation in place, let's get into the first mistake, because I think you'll recognize it immediately. The first mistake is trusting how you feel as your only guide for whether you're overheating or dehydrated. Let me tell you about someone I'll call Frank, a composite of many patients I've spoken with over the years. Frank was 73, active, sharp as a tack, and proud of the fact that he'd never had heat trouble in his life. He'd spend his mornings in the garden the same way he had for decades, moving at what felt to him like a comfortable, easy pace. One July afternoon, his daughter stopped by and noticed he seemed a little slower to respond, a bit more irritable than usual, and unsteady when he stood up. Frank himself didn't feel that thirsty. He didn't feel like anything was wrong. He just felt tired, and tired felt normal for a hot day. This is exactly the trap. Frank's body was already behind on fluids, and his internal thermostat wasn't sounding the alarm the way it once did. He wasn't feeling sick in any dramatic sense. He simply felt a little off, a little slower, the kind of thing that's easy to write off as getting older or having a long morning. But that subtle change was actually his body's early warning sign, showing up in a much quieter way than he expected. Here's what I want you to understand about this. As we age, the signals your body sends, thirst, feeling overheated, even feeling unwell, become less reliable indicators of what's actually happening inside. This isn't something to be afraid of, but it does mean you can't wait to feel bad before you take action. So the practical solution here is simple. Build hydration and cooling into your day proactively, on a schedule, rather than waiting for your body to tell you it's time. That might mean having a glass of water with you every time you sit down, not because you're thirsty, but because it's part of your routine. The same way you might take a daily walk or check the mail. It might mean planning outdoor tasks like gardening for the cooler parts of the early morning rather than midday, regardless of how you happen to feel that morning. Now, I want to be careful here because hydration isn't one size fits all. I'm not going to give you a specific number of glasses of water to drink every day because that number can vary enormously depending on your health conditions, the medications you take, your activity level, the climate you live in, and whether you have any fluid restrictions from a heart or kidney condition. Your doctor can help determine what is appropriate for your specific situation, and that conversation is worth having before summer really sets in, not after you're already in the middle of a heat wave. This idea that you can't fully trust how you feel leads directly into the second mistake because it's closely connected but shows up in a slightly different way. The second mistake is underestimating how quickly indoor heat can become dangerous, especially for someone who lives alone. I think about a woman I'll call Margaret, 79 years old, living by herself in a home she'd owned for over 30 years. Margaret wasn't the type to complain, and she genuinely didn't like running her air conditioning much, partly out of habit, partly to save on the electric bill. She'd grown up without air conditioning at all and always felt she could manage. During one particularly hot stretch, her apartment simply never cooled down. Even at night, day after day, the indoor temperature crept higher, and Margaret adapted the way people do, a little more tired here, a little less appetite there, without ever connecting the dots to the heat itself. What people often don't realize is that indoor heat exposure over multiple days can be just as dangerous as being outside in the sun, sometimes more so because there's no obvious moment where you think, I need to get out of this heat. You're just sitting in your own living room and the temperature is quietly working against you hour after hour. This is especially true overnight when your body should be getting a break from the heat but isn't because the house never really cools down. The practical solution here isn't complicated, but it does require a shift in thinking. If you have air conditioning, using it during the hottest parts of the day isn't a luxury, it's a genuine safety tool, the same way a smoke detector is. If cost is a concern, many areas have cooling centers or community resources specifically designed to help older adults during extreme heat, and it's worth knowing where the nearest one is before you actually need it. Fans can help with comfort, but I want to be honest with you. When the air temperature itself is very high, a fan alone may not be enough to prevent overheating because it's just moving hot air around rather than cooling it. Knowing the difference matters, and this is where I'd encourage you to think about your home, almost like you'd think about checking the batteries in a smoke detector, not something you deal with in the middle of an emergency, but something you prepare in advance. Knowing which rooms in your home stay coolest, having a plan for where you'd go if your air conditioning failed during a heat wave, and checking in with a neighbor or family member during particularly hot stretches, these small preparations make a real difference. There's one more piece of this that I want to mention because families often ask me about it. Upper floors of a home or apartment tend to trap heat more than lower floors, and rooms with a lot of west-facing windows can become surprisingly warm in the late afternoon, even with curtains drawn. If you know that a particular room in your home tends to run hot, it's worth planning to spend the warmest hours of the day somewhere cooler, rather than trying to power through in a room you already know struggles to stay comfortable. This sounds obvious once you say it out loud, but in the middle of a busy or ordinary day, it's easy to simply sit where you always sit without thinking about whether that spot is working against you. I also want to mention something for the family members watching this because you play an important role here too. A simple phone call during a heat wave, not even about the heat specifically, just a normal check-in, can reveal a lot. If a parent or older relative sounds a little more tired than usual, a little slower to follow the conversation, that's worth gently asking about. You don't have to make it dramatic. Something as simple as, how's the house holding up in this heat, opens the door for them to mention if something feels off without making them feel like they're being checked up on. That idea of preparation, of knowing your plan before you need it, connects naturally to the third mistake, which is one I see especially often with caregivers. The third mistake is focusing so much on someone else's safety that you forget to protect your own. This one is deeply personal for a lot of families, so I want to spend a moment on it. I think of a man I'll call Walter, 68 years old, caring for his wife who had mobility difficulties. Walter's entire day revolved around her comfort, making sure she had water, making sure the room she rested in stayed cool, making sure she never had to overexert herself in the heat. He was, by every measure, an attentive and loving caregiver. But in focusing so intensely on her, Walter often skipped his own water breaks, pushed through his own fatigue, and didn't think to check in on his own hydration until he found himself lightheaded while helping her across the room. This pattern comes up more than people realize. Caregivers, by nature, are focused outward, watching, anticipating, responding to someone else's needs, but heat doesn't make exceptions for good intentions. If you're a caregiver, your ability to help the person you love depends entirely on your own health holding steady. If you become overheated or dehydrated, you're not just at risk yourself, you may no longer be able to help the person who needs you. The solution here is really about building small habits of self-check into your caregiving routine, the same way you'd build in checks for the person you're caring for. Some caregivers find it helpful to set a simple reminder. Every time you offer your loved one water, take a moment for yourself too. Every time you check the thermostat for them, ask yourself honestly how you're feeling. It sounds almost too simple to matter, but pairing these habits together means you're far less likely to forget yourself in the process. I also want to say this clearly because I think it needs to be said. Taking care of yourself as a caregiver isn't selfish. It's not a distraction from caring for someone else. It's part of what makes you able to keep caring for them at all. I've talked with many caregivers over the years who describe a kind of quiet guilt around this idea, the feeling that focusing on their own needs, even for a moment, takes something away from the person they're caring for. I want to gently push back on that. A caregiver who takes their own water break, who steps into a cool room for 5 minutes, who says, I need to sit down for a moment, that person is not failing at caregiving. They're protecting their ability to keep doing it today and tomorrow and the day after that. There's nothing selfish about staying capable. Now, the fourth mistake is a little different from the first three because it has less to do with behavior in the moment and more to do with planning ahead. And it's one that surprises a lot of people. The fourth mistake is not reviewing your medications before summer arrives or assuming that because a medication is common, it has no relationship to heat at all. I want to be very careful and very responsible with how I talk about this because I never want anyone watching this to think I'm telling them to stop, skip, or change their medication in any way. That decision belongs entirely between you and your doctor or pharmacist, and nothing I say here should be treated as a reason to alter what you've been prescribed. What I do want you to know is this. Certain medications that many older adults take regularly, some blood pressure medications, some diuretics, certain medications for mental health conditions, and others can influence how your body manages fluid balance or responds to heat. This doesn't mean these medications are dangerous. Most of the time, they're essential, and stopping them without medical guidance could be far riskier than the heat itself. But it does mean that if you're taking one of these medications, it's genuinely worth having a conversation with your doctor or pharmacist before the hot months arrive, simply so you understand what signs to watch for and whether any adjustments to your routine, not your medication, but things like hydration habits or activity timing might be worth discussing. Think of a woman I'll call Susan, who had been on the same blood pressure medication for years without any issue. She'd never had a problem with heat before, and she didn't think to connect her long-standing prescription with the particularly intense heat wave her region experienced one summer. It wasn't that her medication was wrong for her, it was simply that nobody had ever specifically talked with her about how that combination of heat, medication, and reduced fluid intake could interact. A short conversation with her pharmacist that spring might have given her a clearer picture of what to watch for. The practical takeaway here isn't to worry about your medications. It's to take 5 minutes, maybe when you're picking up a refill or at your next routine appointment, to ask a simple question. Is there anything about my medications I should be aware of when it comes to heat? That single question, asked once a year before summer, can give you information that's specific to you rather than generic advice that may or may not apply to your situation. I want to emphasize something here because I don't want this section to leave you feeling anxious about medications you may have relied on safely for years. Medications exist because they manage real conditions, often very serious ones. The goal is never to second guess your prescriptions on your own. The goal is simply to add one more layer of awareness to your summer planning, the same way you might think about sun protection or staying hydrated. A short conversation with a professional who knows your full medical history will always give you better guidance than anything general I could offer here, and that's exactly why I keep pointing you back to that conversation. This brings us to the final mistake, and I want you to pay close attention to this one because it's the one that can genuinely change what you do in a real emergency. The fifth mistake is not knowing the difference between heat exhaustion and heat stroke and waiting too long to get help when something serious is happening. This is the part of the video where I want to slow down and be as clear as I possibly can because this information matters more than anything else we've talked about today. Heat exhaustion and heat stroke are related, but they are not the same thing, and knowing the difference can change how quickly you or a loved one gets the right kind of help. Heat exhaustion often shows up as heavy sweating, weakness, dizziness, nausea, a headache, and a rapid pulse. The person may feel clammy and unwell, but they're generally still alert and able to respond to questions, even if they feel lousy. This is genuinely important to take seriously, but it typically responds well to getting into a cool place, sipping fluids, and resting. Heat stroke is different, and it's a medical emergency. This is where I want to correct something that a lot of people have heard and believe, which isn't quite accurate. Many people think heat stroke always means completely dry skin with no sweating at all. That's simply not true. Skin during heat stroke can be hot and dry, but it can also be hot and sweaty or flushed and red. The skin appearance alone isn't a reliable way to rule heat stroke in or out. What matters far more is a change in mental status. This is the key sign I want you to remember. Confusion, disorientation, slurred speech, acting strangely or out of character, difficulty staying awake or responding, loss of consciousness. If you notice these kinds of changes in yourself or in someone else after being in significant heat, this is not something to wait on. This is not a situation where you take their temperature, see a number that seems borderline, and decide to wait another hour to see if things improve. Severe symptoms like confusion, disorientation, or loss of consciousness after heat exposure mean it's time to call emergency services immediately. You do not need one specific thermometer reading to justify getting help. The behavior and mental state changes are enough on their own. I think about a story that a family member once shared with me, a daughter who called her father one hot afternoon and noticed he sounded confused on the phone, giving answers that didn't quite make sense, forgetting what they'd just been talking about moments earlier. It would have been easy to assume he was just tired or having an off day, but she trusted that something felt different, called for help, and got him the care he needed quickly. That's the kind of instinct I want you to trust, in yourself and in the people you love. If something feels different, especially involving confusion or altered behavior after heat exposure, don't talk yourself out of getting help. I also want to address something practical here because I know some of you are wondering about it. What do you actually do if you notice early signs of heat exhaustion in yourself or someone else before things become severe? Move to a cooler place as quickly as you can, whether that's an air-conditioned room or even just a shaded area. Loosen or remove any unnecessary clothing. Sip water if the person is fully alert and able to swallow safely. Cool the skin gently with a damp cloth, particularly at the neck, wrists, and forehead. And then simply watch closely. If symptoms improve steadily, that's reassuring. But if symptoms worsen, or if at any point confusion, disorientation, or loss of consciousness appears, that's your signal to stop watching and start calling for emergency help immediately. There's no shame in calling for help and having it turn out to be a milder situation than expected. It is always better to reach out too early than too late. Now, I want to bring all of this together because I don't want you to walk away from this video simply cataloging 5 things to be worried about. That's not the point, and it's not the spirit in which I wanted to share this with you. Here's what I really want you to take from our time together today. Getting older does not mean you're helpless against something like heat. It doesn't mean summer becomes something to fear or avoid. What it does mean is that your body works a little differently than it used to. And once you understand that difference, you have real practical power to protect yourself and the people you love. That's the whole idea behind everything we've covered. Not fear, but understanding. Not restriction, but preparation. You now know that your feelings of thirst or fatigue may not fully reflect what's happening inside your body. So building hydration into your routine proactively matters more than waiting to feel thirsty. You know that your own home, even without a single moment outdoors, can become a genuine risk during a prolonged heat wave, and that using cooling resources isn't indulgent, it's protective. If you're a caregiver, you know that your own well-being isn't separate from your ability to care for someone else. It's the foundation of it. You know that a simple 5-minute conversation with your doctor or pharmacist about your medications before summer can give you clarity that generic advice never could. And most importantly, you now know the real difference between heat exhaustion and heat stroke. And you know that confusion or altered behavior after heat exposure is never something to wait out. None of this requires you to live differently out of anxiety. It simply asks you to be a little more intentional, to drink water on a schedule rather than by feeling, to know where the coolest room in your house is, to have that one conversation with your pharmacist, and to trust the instinct that something feels wrong if it ever does. So here's what I'd encourage you to do this week before the next heat wave arrives, not during it. Take a look at your home and identify where you'd go if it got too hot to stay comfortable. If you're on regular medications, make a note to ask your doctor or pharmacist that one simple question at your next visit. And if you're caring for someone else, write yourself a small reminder, literally on a sticky note, if that helps, to check in with your own hydration every time you check in with theirs. I genuinely love to hear from you on this. Have you noticed that heat affects you differently now than it did 10 or 20 years ago? Maybe you've noticed you don't feel thirsty the way you used to, or that a hot afternoon takes more out of you than it once did. I'd really like to know. Leave a comment and share your experience, because I think a lot of people watching this will recognize themselves in what you write. And these conversations help all of us learn from each other. If this was helpful to you today, consider subscribing, because I'll be covering more topics like this. Practical, honest conversations about the changes that come with getting older and how to navigate them with confidence rather than fear. Before we finish, I want to say clearly that everything I've shared with you today is meant to be general health education, not a replacement for personalized medical advice. Your own health history, medications, and conditions are unique to you, and any decisions about your care, your hydration needs, or your medications should be made together with your doctor or pharmacist who knows your specific situation. Getting older brings changes, that's simply true. But understanding those changes rather than fearing them is what allows you to keep doing the things you love. Gardening in the morning, caring for the people you love, enjoying your summer safely and with confidence. That's really what I hope you take away from this conversation today. Not worry, but a little more wisdom and a little more control over how you move through the season ahead. Take care of yourself out there. I'll see you in the next video.